In this video, we're going to look at modern password authentication using Stytch. Hey everyone, Wes here with Productive Dev. I hope you're doing well. In this video, we're going to examine how we can use Stytch to do modern password authentication. Now, if you've seen several of the previous videos on the channel I've made where we're using Stytch, you'll know that Stytch is an excellent platform for passwordless authentication, which is the ability for our users to authenticate with our web apps using passwordless means. In this video, however, we're going to explore a new feature that Stytch has released recently, which is the ability to actually use a traditional password to authenticate. Now, of course, you'll be familiar with password authentication as it is a very traditional means of authenticating into web applications, and of course it's ubiquitous across the web today. However, even though password authentication is a tried and true means of traditional authentication on the web, Stytch is bringing us several very powerful features to this means of authentication that help us keep our users more secure and our authentication more streamlined. So for instance, Stytch provides us with an API to check password strength, so that's something that we don't have to necessarily implement on our own. It's also going to check whether or not a user's credentials have been leaked as part of a known data breach in the past. And so behind the scenes, Stytch is actually checking whether those credentials are registered with the website Have I Been Owned? Have I Been Owned is a website that catalogs virtually all known data breaches, and we can actually use this via Stytch to check whether or not the credentials that we're providing to log in with have been part of a known data breach in the past. Additionally, Stytch is also providing us with a really nice workflow for resetting user passwords. So I don't know about you, but in the past, if I'm using a password authentication method and for some reason I don't have access to my password or I've forgotten it, it's often the case that, I don't necessarily want to change my password. However, I would like to still be able to log in. So Stytch provides us with a very nice reset password means in which our users can actually reset their passwords if they like, or they can just sort of fall back to one of Stytch's passwordless authentication means like sending magic links. So we're going to look at all of this. We're going to integrate a password authentication option into our Mindful Gifts application, which is the application that we've used to authenticate both using magic links and crypto wallets, and now traditional password authentication using Stytch. So if you get anything out of this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. I'm going to continue making more content about web application development. I've also got lots more in the pipeline for AWS and machine learning this year. So stay tuned for that content, and thanks for watching. Now let's dig into password authentication using Stytch. So let's take a quick look at the application that we're going to be expanding upon in this video. You may remember previously we built this very simple e-commerce application called Mindful Gifts, and we integrated Stytch in such a way so as to allow our users to authenticate using passwordless authentication. This enabled our users to sign in using magic links, for instance, or crypto wallets using MetaMask with the Ethereum blockchain. In the case of magic links, we provide an email address here. This is going to kick off an email to our user's email address on behalf of our application. And then when a user clicks a link in that email, they'll be redirected back into our Mindful Gifts web application in an authenticated state. We're now going to look at how we can extend this application to use a more traditional authentication means, which is using an email and password combination. Now, Stytch is also going to provide us with a lot of very powerful tooling to make this very secure and actually quite simple to set up. So you'll see that we'll create a login form here with email and password, allowing our users to log in. We'll also create the ability to reset a password. This is going to send our users a reset link where they can be redirected back to our application to create a new password. It's also going to provide them with the ability to simply log in using a sort of magic link flow for just clicking login directly from their email address and being redirected back to our application in just the same way that magic links already work. It's also going to provide us with the ability to sign up. Of course, we need to create a password when we create an account using a password flow. And one of the nice things that it's also going to provide us with is the ability to assess the strength of a password. And so this endpoint is provided by Stytch. And so if we provide, say, a weak password here, like if we just use password, you'll see that Stytch is giving us an error here or a warning letting us know, hey, this is actually top 10 common password. If we were to say make it something bad like ABC, ABC, Stytch is going to also give us some other tips here. So if we have a slightly strong password, you can see, let's make it a little bit weaker here. You can see it's going to tell us to make something a bit stronger and give us some tips here. So we're going to go ahead and provide a strong password, and then we're going to click sign up. In this case, this is going to create our user in Stytch and authenticate us and actually now redirect us with a session token for our particular web application. So let's go ahead and sign out here, and let's imagine that we needed to reset our password. So I'm going to click reset password here, and I'm going to provide the same email address, send reset link. Now it's going to tell us to check our inbox. If we head over to our inbox, we can see that we get our password reset email, and we have the ability, again, to log in using the standard magic link here or to reset a password. So let's say that I do actually want to reset the password, and we're going to get a screen here that will build to create a new password, and then we'll go ahead and reset it. Now we'll be forced to log in with it again. And we're logged in. So we're going to build both the front end as well as the back end for this. We're going to integrate Stytch's new password feature into our application. And in doing so, we're going to see actually how easy it is, frankly, to extend our existing application with a new password feature. I should note that patrons of the channel will get access to this source code as well as all the source code on this channel. So I thank you for your support. If you'd like to support the channel via Patreon, I'll send you a link to invite you to this repository as well as all the code in other repositories throughout the channel. So thanks again for your support. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into some code. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is just make sure that our client application, the Vue 3 application, is running. To do that, we just need to start the Vue dev server. So in the root of the Vue 3 project, which in terms of this project is in the subdirectory client and then mindful gifs, where you'll notice that we have our package.json. We're going to run the command npm run dev, and this is going to start our Vue dev server running on port 3000 locally. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to work on the back end where we can see exactly how we integrate with Stytch from the server side. For this, we're going to have to add a number of new types and a number of new endpoints to extend our application to use email and password. So let's take a look at that now. So here we are in our .NET 6 application. You may recall that we're using the .NET 6 minimal API paradigm, in which case we have a single program.cs file, which itself contains all of the endpoint mappings for our API. So you'll notice that previously we created endpoints to create a user or log in a user using magic links and to verify their token and to authenticate their magic link. So we won't change any of that. We're simply going to extend our server-side application to include several new endpoints. Of course, for this, we're going to need to make new request and response types, and we'll do that shortly. First, let's take a look at some of the new endpoints that we'd like to create. The first one is quite simple. It's just an endpoint that we need to actually register a user. So for this, we'll have the URL register, and it's going to be exposed as a post request endpoint. And we're going to post to the register endpoint a password auth request object. This will be a new type that we need to create. And as we've seen previously, we can also inject services into these particular requests. So you'll notice that for this callback, we're injecting an instance of iAuth service, and .NET 6 is going to wire that up using dependency injection for us. So we'll have access to that within the scope of this particular request. We're going to create a new method on our existing auth service, which enables us to pass an email address and a password to this register with password method, which will return a response. So if this response is successful, we're immediately going to return OK, which is an HTTP 200 response. I'm going to place the result from that as the response body for this request. Otherwise, if we have an error message, I'm going to do something that is perhaps a little bit sloppy here, but in order to simplify the client-side handling of the response, if we have a particular type of error message, for now I'm simply going to return this as a 200 OK response to which I pass the response body. Otherwise, I'm going to return a bad request. So I'm doing this because I don't want to handle the custom non-200 success error code on the front end where we're using fetch. I don't want to catch and handle some specific type of error. I'm just going to say, okay, this was a quote successful response. If it has an error message, I'm going to handle that on the front end by displaying it. But this kind of keeps things a little bit simpler for now. Technically, what we might want to do in the future is to actually make this a bad request response or use a more specific type of HTTP response code here and handle those errors in a little bit more of a robust fashion on the client side. For now, this keeps things simple. And in any case, if we have an error message, we're going to pass it back to the client side using this method. Okay, so you can see we need to create a couple of new types here. First of all, we need to create password auth request. So under our models directory, we have a Stytch namespace, and I'm going to create a new namespace under this for passwords. And for the sake of expediency, I'm going to actually add all of the password types, request response types that we need for the password flow, I should say. And so this is a number of new types, but you'll see that they're actually quite simple. They represent simple DTOs that we use to communicate back and forth with Stytch's platform. So let's take a look at those now. First of all, we'll have a Stytch password login request type. This will contain the user's email and password, as well as optionally a value for the session duration minutes, which is going to start a new session for that user of a particular length. In this case, I'm going to set it with a default value of a calendar day. We'll have a corresponding login response type that we get back from Stytch. This is going to contain a number of different properties that you'll see are quite common through the various auth responses from Stytch, including a status code, request ID, user ID, email ID, importantly a session token that we'll use to actually authorize a user so that they have permission to do various things within our application, however we choose to set that up, as well as an error message. Then we'll have a type for setting a new password for a user. In this case, this just requires us to tell Stytch what the password and the token is, and Stytch can then link that up with the particular user whose password is changing, as well as ensure that that is an authorized request to change a user's password. That response is going to look very similar to many of the other auth responses. And rather than complicate things with some type of shared type or a type hierarchy or anything like that here, I've kept things very granular. So although this type shares many of the same, much of the same data that the other response types also contain, for the sake of granularity and sort of parity with what I'm seeing in the docs on Stytch's side, as far as API request and response types go, I've just created separate C# types for all of those scenarios. That way, if anything does change on Stytch's side for particular endpoints, we only need to come in and change one type in our case and not worry about sort of a shared type across different types of auth responses. So that's why you may see a bit of duplication here in terms of like response types looking quite similar to each other, whether it's for setting a password or logging in. Okay, to actually kick off the reset flow, when a user just basically needs to provide their email, and so we provide this to Stytch on a Stytch password reset request, which just has the string property email. The response from that will return a request ID, status code, and user ID. And then finally, this pair of types we have for checking the strength of a password. We just provide a password string for that on the Stytch password strength check request type. And then Stytch in turn is going to provide us with a very nice rich object that contains, in addition to the status code, whether or not that was a valid password, as well as a score, which I believe is like 0 through 4. We'll also get information as to whether or not this was a breached password. So Stytch is actually wrapping a functionality calling haveibeenowned.com, which is a repository for credentials that have been part of known data breaches in the past. So by doing this, Stytch will then actually be able to notify us as clients and our users who are using their password credentials with us, whether or not those credentials have been exposed in a known data breach. And so that's very nice feedback that we can get. And then in addition, we also get some other feedback about the strength of the password, including a warning that Stytch can send back to us, which might say like, hey, this is a very common password, or that we don't necessarily need to use capital letters in our password. It will give us various warnings as well as some suggestions here. So that feedback is very useful, and I believe Stytch is wrapping an open source library for those suggestions to help us follow best practices with our password creation. I'll post a link to that particular library that I'm talking about here in the description. Okay, and then finally in the models directory, I'm also going to add some new classes here, which are our own DTOs, so that we kind of decouple our own requests and responses from the particular shape of classes that we send to Stytch's API itself. So we can sort of map between our own type and Stytch's type that it expects on its API. And so we'll have a password auth request, simple email and password, a password new set request containing the password and token, the password new set response, which contains the whether or not it was successful, the status code and the session token, as well as the user ID and error message, the password reset response type, password reset request type, and password strength response type. So many of these, of course, map very closely, if not one-to-one, to many of the types that we're using, the new types that we're using for Stytch passwords for their platform. Okay, so I'm going to close all of our new types, and we're going to head back into our service layer, under business logic, and into our auth service. And we're also going to open up program.cs again. So you'll notice that our auth service will now need to have a new method called register with password. So let's go ahead and update the interface to auth service to support all of these new password related features. So in our auth service interface, we're going to have a number of new methods, everything that we need to have to support password auth. And I'm going to actually do a file scoped namespace here since we're using .NET 6. And so we're now going to have the ability to log in with a password as we just looked at. We're also going to have that endpoint for checking password strength and resetting a password by email. This will be the endpoint that we hit on our side to trigger a reset email to go out to our users. And then we'll need a method as well to set a new password for that user when they're redirected back to our reset password form. So under program.cs now, we're simply going to invoke register with password. And if we don't have an error message, so this will be a new property that we will set as nullable string on our auth response object. This auth response is a type that we have used in the past and we're reusing now for password authentication. We head back into program. So if there is an error message again, in this case, just for the sake of simplicity, we're returning that error message on an OK response so that we don't need to do that custom error handling on the client side yet. Otherwise, we're sending a bad request. Okay, so now we need to actually implement some of these new methods, starting with register with password in our auth service. So let's head back to our auth service. And if we scroll up, we'll get a compiler error here that we haven't implemented all the new members. So let's go ahead and implement those 5 new missing members. And .NET, or Rider rather, will create these empty methods that just throw not implemented exceptions. First of all of these are going to be async tasks, so we can go ahead and make all of them async. And we'll start by implementing register with password. So if you'll recall, if you saw the previous videos where we were making requests to Stytch's platform, it's going to follow a very similar pattern here, wherein we're using an HTTP client factory, which is injected into this class to create a new HTTP client. We're going to build out a payload, serialize it into JSON, and then use it to make a request with an auth header to Stytch's platform, which is going to handle all of the business logic on Stytch's side, and they're simply going to respond to us with the data that we need to use to interact with their platform, of course. If we have an exception, we're going to catch it, and otherwise we're going to return some particular type that's useful back to our controller layer, which is just in program.cs. So when it comes to registering with a password, it's going to look actually pretty similar. First of all, we're going to create a new HTTP client instance using our injected HTTP client factory. We'll also log that we're registering a new user. Then we're going to build out a payload, in this case of type Stytch password login request, to which we attach our email and password. We'll do what we need to do to serialize that payload. For this, we create a very basic JSON serializer options instance to which we then are able to use when we serialize that data as JSON, as a JSON string here. So we'll call that serialized payload. Then we're going to open up a try catch block. We're going to build our auth header here and a request object, which is an instance of an HTTP request method. If you recall, build encoded auth string here is really simple. This is just going to build a basic auth string that we need to attach to our HTTP header. And so this auth string is configured using the project ID of the particular Stytch project that we are working with, as well as the secret. This secret value, in our case, we are getting from configuration. This is something that you can find as your API key when you log into the Stytch platform. We're going to base64 encode that auth string here, which again has the prefix project ID : and then the secret. Base64 encode that, and then set that as the value on a basic auth header. We're going to return that, which we can then set as the authorization header on this particular request. We also need to make sure that we're setting the accept header as application JSON and the content, the post body here, as that serialized payload that we just built containing the user's email and password as JSON. Okay, then let's go ahead and send that request off. We can simply call send async on our HTTP client, passing it the request that we just built, and then actually deserializing that response back into a Stytch password login response. If things look good, in other words, in our case, if the response message has a success status code and we get a user login response back, it's not null, we're going to create a new app user here. And we're going to add that user to our own database. We're going to set the user's email ID and the Stytch user ID on that email so that we can turn around and then look them up by their Stytch user ID or email ID should we ever need to, which we will when we want to, say, log in a particular user and get information about them, of course. Then we're going to new up an app user here. We're going to set the email ID and user ID from the response onto the user's email ID and Stytch user ID respectively. We're going to persist this data in our own database. Note that we're absolutely not saving any user passwords in our database. That's all handled on Stytch's auth platform, so no passwords anywhere in the data. In our application, simply the user's email ID and Stytch user ID that we can use to link a user when Stytch can authenticate them back to our own system. So we'll add those using the DB context that we've injected, and then call save changes to persist that state to our database, and then return an auth response. So this is the happy path. In the event that we don't have a success status code, or our user login response is null, we're going to return is success false on the auth response with a null user ID and an error message if we have it, otherwise empty string. Then for now, we'll catch a broad exception and return an auth response with false for is success, null user ID, and internal server error as our error message. Okay, so that was our register endpoint. Things are looking pretty simple there. I'm going to also, just while we're in here, file scope the namespace since we're using .NET 6, which kind of flattens things out one level. Now let's take a look at the endpoint we need to construct if we want to log a user in. So, of course, this is going to look pretty similar in that we are going to create a new instance of an HTTP client and create a payload, in this case for a Stytch password login request payload. We're going to serialize that payload as usual, and then once again in a try catch block here, we're going to try and make a request with Stytch to log a user in this time. So again, similar pattern. We're going to build out our encoded auth string. In this case, the request URL that we're going to hit will be our authenticate password URL. And actually, when we made the request previously for registering a user, we also used this authenticate password URL. This is a new property that we need to create on our Stytch options object. So I'm going to go ahead and create that here. And we'll make it a string, of course. Now this is bound to, this value is bound to this object using the .NET options pattern where we can inject an iOptions interface into a class. Let's take a look at that. So here at the top of auth service, in the constructor. So what's happening here is we're injecting iOptions of type Stytch options, this generic type, into our Stytch service constructor. This is our auth service. And we're setting the backing field, which is of type Stytch options, to stitchops.value. So calling .value on the generic type here is going to bind the value of Stytch ops, our backing field here, to the values set through any number of different configuration sources. And we're using appsettings.json for our case. So under appsettings.development.json, we're going to create a new key value pair under the Stytch object here that maps that new password link URL to a value in the Stytch sandbox. So under magic link URL here, at the time of this recording, that particular URL is test.stitch.com/v1/passwords. Okay, so with that, let's head back down to our new method. So here we're interpolating the value for authenticate. So the string is that test passwords endpoint /authenticate on Stytch's platform. We set our headers as usual and put our payload into the HTTP request content, which again in this case is just email and password. We're authenticating a user. And if things are successful, then we're going to go ahead and send that request. And then with the response, we're going to deserialize that into a Stytch password login response. In the event that that was successful, we are going to attempt to find the first user who has the user ID from that login response. So if this is successful, then Stytch is telling us, yes, this was the correct email and password combination, and I have a user to give you in return. This was an authenticated request. I'm now going to return you the data for this particular user. In addition, we're going to get a session token back so that we can then use that to make authorized requests once we've now been authenticated. Okay, so we'll return a new auth response otherwise with is success set to false, and we'll do something very similar when we catch any exceptions in this process. Okay, so now let's take a look at the remaining endpoints, one of which is checking password strength. So things are going to look very similar here. We'll create our HTTP client. We'll build our password strength check request payload, which just requires a password. Again, we'll serialize that using the JSON serializer. And then we'll have our try catch block here. In this case, the endpoint is at /strength check relative to the authenticate password URL on Stytch's platform. And we send this request off with just the password, this object rather, that contains the password. And then we deserialize that into perhaps the most interesting type that we're dealing with today, which is the password strength check response. So here we build out our own password strength response type on the success response. With the score, we can use that to control the UI. If we have sort of like a progress bar from 0 strength to fully strong password, we can determine whether or not that's been a breached password and provide any warnings and suggestions on the response itself here. So clean that up a little bit. Otherwise, in the event that that was not successful, of course, as we have on the other endpoints, we'll return a response with is success set to false and catch and handle an exception here. Okay, so just 2 endpoints left here, one to reset a password by email and the other to set the new password once we've sort of triggered that process. So for this, again, things look very similar. At the top of this method, basically building out an HTTP client and serializing a payload. This time we're just kicking off that email to reset a user's password, so we just need the user email. We serialize that on a HTTP post request that we prepare to create. And then again, try catch here. We'll build the auth string for the header and then send that request out asynchronously. We'll deserialize that into a type Stytch password reset response. And then if that's successful, return the password reset response with is success to true. Very simple. Otherwise, again, handle the case in which we're not successful or we throw an exception. So this is a very simple endpoint at email reset start relative to the Stytch's authenticate password URL. This, again, just triggers that email. When this gets fired off, the user is going to then receive an email in their inbox that says, click a link here to return to our application to set a new password or to simply authenticate with our application using a magic link. And so we'll see here that, of course, that means that we need to support magic links already, which is, again, something that we did in a previous video. So if you'd like to do that and for this to work, then be sure to check that video out and set up magic links for this application. And then finally, our final new endpoint for the backend here is for setting a new password. And so in this case, again, sort of standard issue at this point, we create an HTTP client and create our auth header, this time sending it to the URL /email/reset, and then deserializing the response back to a new set response and returning that back to our client with a success flag set to true, and otherwise handling any errors. So that is essentially all the work that we needed to do to set up the new endpoints to support password authentication with Stytch on our back end. Let's take a look at building out the forms on our front end that are going to interact directly with our API now in Vue. Okay, so here we are in the project for our front end here, our Vue project. You'll notice that we have a source directory under which we have a number of subdirectories to organize the various files for our client side, including a pages subdirectory, which currently just contains a home page and a login, and then the router, which contains an auth guard, which is used to handle some of the complex logic with checking the route and storing session tokens for us in local storage, and then index.ts, which contains definition for our router and our routes. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to do a slight refactor. So what I'm going to do here is also create a new subdirectory here called components. And we're going to extract some form components here to make our design just a little bit more modular. Again, simple use case here, but it will come in handy in terms of cleaning things up a little bit for us here. So the first file that we're going to create under pages is going to be a page for logging in a user with a password. So we're going to call this login password. And this is going to be a very simple component. We're going to actually wrap a component login password form that we'll create now. So under components, we're going to create a new Vue file called login password form. So this is going to also be relatively simple. We're going to have a component here called login password form, of course. The data that we have on this particular component will be some standard data that we have also seen before when using magic links, namely whether or not So this is a pretty simple component. We have some data that includes data as to whether or not the user. So this is a pretty simple component. We have some data here, a Boolean flag to determine whether or not the request is So this is a pretty simple component that we have here. First of all, we have some data. We have an isLoading Boolean that lets us know whether or not a request is in flight. We have a user email and password, and we have an error message that we can display. We have a single computed property here called sendMessage, which we're going to use to control So we have a relatively simple component here. We have some data on the component. isLoading is a Boolean that lets us know whether or not a request is in flight. We have an email and a password as a string and an error message as a string that we can display. We also have a single computed property here, sendMessage, So we have a pretty simple component here. First of all, we have some data on the component, an isLoading flag that lets us know whether or not a request is in flight. We have an email and password as well as an error message that we can display. A single computed property here called sendMessage, which returns 1 moment if things are not loading, otherwise returns login. So we'll use this on the button to log a user in. And then we have a single async method here, which makes a call out to our server, which is currently hard-coded in this component at localhost 8080 /login with password. And here we're making a post request with the user's email and password to our endpoint. As we just saw earlier, our login with password endpoint in .NET is now handling this email and password. We're going to get that data back and serialize it into JSON. And then in this case, we're going to set a session token local storage key to the session token that we get back on that data from the HTTP response, and then push the user to the root URL here / at which case our auth guard takes over and checks to make sure that this session token exists. Otherwise, it sends our user back to the login form. Let's get a recap on how that's actually working. If we head into router and then under auth guard, we can see that that's essentially exactly what's happening. You'll notice that in the router itself, there's a before each lifecycle hook that's called, in which case handle auth is invoked. Handle auth coming from our auth guard. And so I'm going to remove some console logs in here actually that we did previously. And so we have the special case in which a user returns to our application with a session token in the query string parameter, in which case we can then set the session token that way. That was part of the magic link flow. Otherwise, we are getting the session token from local storage. And if we've matched an auth route, a route which requires a user to be authorized, then we take that session token and we verify it. That way we can be sure that our session is still valid with Stytch. And then in the event that things are not okay, we return a user back to login. Otherwise, we return a user ultimately to the destination that they were looking to go to. If we go to login explicitly and they have a session token, then in fact, we verify that token and return the user back to the root of the application. So that way, a user doesn't necessarily need to log in if they're already authenticated. I'm going to change a few things in the auth guard here to create separate routes for logging in with a password or magic link, and it's really up to you what you choose here. Let's say we want the sort of default redirect when a user isn't authenticated to go back to the password form. So I'm going to set the next location here when that type of thing happens to /login/password, whereas previously we just had /login. So I'm going to do that in every case that we currently have here for it. And then under our router itself, I'm going to create a new endpoint here for login/password. And then we'll be sure to import that new component. And to make it more explicit for logging in with a magic link, I'm also going to make that login at /login magic link. And we're going to change the name of our previous login component to login magic link. Okay, so we can actually visit that. And now back in our router, we can fix the import. Okay, so if we go back to our page and we refresh, and if you're at /login, you may just wish to go back to localhost 3000 and then the root URL, we should now be redirected to login/password, and we should see our new form here. Now we have a number of other links here that we need to actually set up, including sign up and reset password. The magic link should work, and so that's looking good. So let's head back into our code. And I'm going to do one bit of cleanup here. So under login magic link, we have a pretty big component here that we can actually simplify and create a magic link password form. So I'm going to do that now. So we'll call this login magic link form. And here we are simply going to extract most of the, and here what I've done is I'm simply going to extract most of what we have on our login magic link page and simply embed our login magic link form here, which is the new component. So we just extracted that, and we have our login with a magic link form extracted now. So just a little bit of refactor there. So now what I'd like to do is, I think, create the form that allows our users to actually register. So we're going to call this our sign up form. We're going to place this in components. And here we're going to have another fairly simple component, this representing the form that includes the fields for a user's email and password to, of course, sign up. The data that we'll have here is an isLoading flag, email and password. Then I'm going to have data for a debounce that we'll set up shortly, and then a score, which represents how strong the password is, and I'm going to set that to 0 here. A warning as an empty string, suggestions as an empty array, and then an error message as an empty string here. This computed property register CTA is simply going to be the button text that changes whether or not the request to register a user is in flight. And then we have our register account method. So I think it's actually useful to take a look at the check strength method first, since that's sort of going to be invoked first. We're going to set suggestions to an empty array and warning to an empty string. We're going to call clear timeout on debounce. And then we're going to set the value of debounce to our set timeout function, the set timeout function with a callback for what we actually want to invoke. So we're going to set isLoading to true, and then send that request off to our server at validate password. This is a post request which takes just the password as the body. So we call JSON stringify password, and then we get the result back as JSON. For the purposes of the UI, I'm simply going to set the score, which is either 0 to 4, to its value times 25. That gives us a sort of percentage, if you will, from 0 to 100. So we'll either get 0, 25, 50, 75, or 100. And then we're going to use that to create a sort of status bar in Tailwind from like nothing to a full green bar, depending on that value. We'll set the suggestions and warning, and then set isLoading equal to false. In the event that we catch, we also set isLoading to false. And then the timeout value here will be 600 milliseconds. So that gives the user some time to actually type in the password before we're checking. We don't want to invoke that endpoint unnecessarily by not having a timeout there. We don't want it like on every keystroke, for instance. So we give the user 600 milliseconds before stopping or after stopping to actually have that request for password strength sent off. You'll notice that the way that this gets bound, and I'll scroll over so you can see all of the Tailwind here for this particular class. It's a bit much, but you get the idea there. On the input for an email is just bound to that email data. Password is bound to the password data. And then the style here is set dynamically. This width of this emerald 400 colored bar is set to either 0 or 25, 50, 75, 100%. In the event that the score is greater than 0 but less than 100, we say try something a bit stronger. In the event that it is explicitly 100, we say that the password looks good. And if we have any suggestions or warnings, we render them out to an unordered list here for either. So for the password input, this is where we invoke check strength. That is the debounced function that we just looked at. Otherwise, when we're good to go, if we're no longer loading and the score is less than 100, otherwise we have a button that we style accordingly depending on whether or not things are loading, or we have a non-100 score or less than 100 score. When we click this, we invoke our register account method. Some more styling here, as well as some links to log in with a magic link or password. So now if we take a look at our register account method, what's happening there is, again, checking whether or not we're loading or the score is less than 100. If that's the case, we shortcut out here. We don't let a user register an account. Otherwise, we set loading to true, we clear out our error message, and then we make a request to our backend to our new register endpoint with the email and password, and we handle the response accordingly. If there are any error messages, we set them here. And finally, we set the session token that we get back on a successful response to session token in local storage and push to our root URL, at which case, again, our auth guard takes over and should find that session token in local storage. Okay, so that is sort of the basics of our sign-up form. If we take a look in our router, we need to make a route for that. So we can go ahead and add that here. And then while we're in here, I'm also going to go ahead and create the remaining routes for reset password and set new password, so we can do that very quickly. These will be two new components under our pages directory. So let's go ahead and add those now. So let's go ahead and add those now. And those each will have their own forms, so we'll add those as well, and we'll take a look at them now. So under reset password, this is the simple form that we need to actually just kick off an email to our user to reset their own password. This just wraps our new reset password form. Very simple, has some very simple data on it that looks very much like a register or login form. In this case, the send reset link method invokes our reset password by email endpoint with the user's email. When that's invoked, that's going to, again, drop an email in our user's inbox via Stytch. And so all we need to do there is basically bind the email data and just to take a look at all the style here. When we click our send reset link button, that function is invoked. And then we can also show some errors here if we don't have a success response. Okay, so when a user receives that email, they'll then click a link which then returns them back to our application if they choose to reset their password. There, they're going to hit our set new password. There, they'll return to our set new password page, which wraps the set new password form. And this one is going to look much like the register form, in which case we have a set new password method to invoke our set new password endpoint, and then upon success pushes the user to the login password page where they can then use that new password to log in. We're going to reuse the check strength method here, a little bit of duplication. This is a case where it'd be really nice to use Vue 3's composition API and extract some of these functions. Perhaps we'll do that in a future video that's focused more on Vue 3 specifically. In any case, this check strength method, once again, is invoking the validate password endpoint that we've set up. So here, it's a reset password form, so all we really need is a single input for that password. If we wanted to ensure that they had the right password, many sites have 2 password inputs, and then we could also validate that they're identical before a user actually submits their new password. So pretty simple UI there. Now, one of the ways that this is going to work is when the reset password endpoint is invoked, if we go back to reset password form, this is going to hit our endpoint reset password by email. So let's just kind of walk through this step by step and go back to the backend and see how that's going to work. So back in our backend, under program.cs, we created our register endpoint, but now we need to create our other endpoints, including that reset password. So this is going to be pretty straightforward. So back in program.cs, we need to make sure that we actually add the new endpoints for the service methods that we just created. First of all, login with password will create a post request at login with password that invokes login with password from our service layer, passing the email and password. Then the validate password endpoint, which invokes the check password strength method that we created. Then the endpoint to reset a password by email, which invokes our auth service reset password by email method. When this is invoked, it's actually going to, of course, send an email to our user. If they click that they would like to set a new password, we're going to need to tell Stytch where exactly to send our user. For that, we're going to create a callback here at reset password by email /callback. This is simply going to cause the request to redirect to our front end with a reset token query parameter. So Stytch is going to make a GET request with a query parameter here with that token, with a token, so that we know that this is a valid, essentially a magic link token. And so we're going to set that as a query parameter with a key value pair reset token of that token value. Then our front end is then going to essentially scrape that query parameter and then use it to turn around and make any subsequent requests. And then finally, we have our set new password endpoint to which we need to pass a password and token to our service layer with a set new password method. If it helps to organize things in this sort of minimal API format where we have a bunch of endpoints, one thing we can do is use a region here. And we'll call this password auth. Typically, I don't really like using regions in C# code. And in this case, I probably would start to consider using a slightly different pattern than the minimal API, where we now kind of have a bucket of endpoints, all of which may do, completely different things throughout our application. And so here I'd consider actually making separate classes for those endpoints. just controller classes, if you will. But for our purposes, creating this region for now temporarily cleans things up. So under our reset password by email endpoint, which we post to, again, we invoke reset password by email from our service layer. So if we head there, this is going to invoke the email reset start endpoint on Stytch's platform that triggers an email to go out to our user, who can then click on a link to say that they want to return to our website and change their password, in which case we need to tell Stytch exactly what we mean by that. What route do we want to send a user back to? And for that, we need to be sure that we have a proper callback URL set on Stytch's platform. So let's go take a look at that now. So here on the dashboard, we can take a look at our redirect URLs, and I've added a URL here, which should point to our server side, which is important, which in my case for the test environment is running on localhost, reset password by email /callback. So what's going to happen is when a user clicks a link in their email to reset their email and return to our application, Stytch is going to basically invoke this endpoint with a query parameter that contains the token that we need to make authorized requests with subsequently. So if we take a look back at our API again and we go into program.cs, we have this callback defined, in which case we grab the token from the query parameter of that request that Stytch is sending, and we send that on a redirect to our client application. So our client application now needs to handle the case when we are coming back to this route, set new password, with a reset token containing that token. So for that, let's take a look at our auth guard, and we can make a very simple change there to wire that up. So in our auth guard, before we already had one for magic links, and in fact, conceptually, what we're dealing with here is a magic link and a token that we're working with. In this case, however, I want to redirect a user to the set new password component. So for that, we're going to say if you have a reset token, again, this value here should map to however we've defined it in our API, which is here, reset token, and that looks correct. So if that's the case, set a local storage value reset token to that reset token, and then move our user to the set new password page. Our set new password page contains our set new password form, which we can go to, and we can see that we are actually getting the reset token from local storage when we turn around and try to make an authorized request to set a new password. So in this way, we ensure that the user, presumably who landed on the set new password page, is coming in an authorized fashion with this token that we've been provided, again, back from Stytch. There's one new component that we need to add here under pages, which is our sign-up form itself, which wraps our sign-up form. So I forgot to add that earlier, apologies. This is the simple form that we use to pass an email and password to our backend to register a new user. So if we take a look back at our page now and refresh, our link should be working. We have a link to reset the password if we like. We have the ability to sign up with a password that we can test out now, and we always have the ability to basically work with a magic link, of course. So let's go ahead and try to sign up. For this, we want to make sure that the .NET API is running. So what I'm going to do is head back into our terminal, and in the server directory, if we change into Mindful API here and simply run .NET run, so we're listening on port 8080 and 8081. Let's go ahead and create a user. And if you want to reuse a user and you've created one already, you can actually head back to the dashboard and go to user management. I'm going to go ahead and delete this user for right now. And we'll come back. And we'll test out our password strength, and it's looking like it's working pretty good for us. We can get different values here. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a password and then sign up. Okay, so we've signed up and now we've actually authenticated with our application. That's looking good. Sign out here, in our case, destroys that token, but you can see, looks like we have a route to fix here. Sign out previously returned us to login. We now need to make that more specific. So if we head into our home component here, under sign out, I'm going to sign out and then push to login/password. And so let's go ahead and try to sign in again. Okay, that looks good. And then sign out now takes us back. And we can't hit our root URL. So our auth guard appears to be working properly as well. Let's say that we want to reset our password, and we can test this out as well. So we're going to send us a reset link. And now let's check our email. Let me get a password reset. And we can go ahead and click reset password. This brings us back to our set new password page, which is looking good. Reset password. Let's try to use our old password first. So we'll try to log in with that one. You'll just have to trust me that it was the old password. We get our error. We use our new password and it logs in successfully. So that's looking pretty good. Let's try one more here. Let's try to reset our password again. Actually, so we'll do that here. We'll get a new reset password link in our inbox. And let's log in without a password. And here we just authenticate using a basic magic link. And so that's looking pretty good. Okay, so that about wraps it up for this video. I really enjoyed using Stytch for password authentication. I'm really glad that they're now offering a more traditional means of authentication, as well as some of the nice features that they have in terms of password strength checking and breach detection. It's really nice for users at this point in time to kind of have the option to use something that's a little bit more familiar to authenticate with. That said, it's also really great that when we do things like reset our password, that we can choose to just sign in using a magic link and not necessarily need to go through the process of creating a new password. So I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, thanks for watching. Remember that patrons of the channel get access to all the source code for this application, as well as all of the other videos that I make for YouTube. Hope you're doing well, and I'll see you next time.